to welcome you to our call to action. And Marcus Harrison Green will be leading us in that. He is the founder and publisher of the South Seattle Emerald and a columnist with a stranger. Growing up in South Seattle, he experienced the impact of one-dimensional stories about marginalized communities, which taught him the value of authentic narratives. After an unfulfilling stint in the investment world, Marcus returned to his community with a newfound purpose of telling stories with nuance, complexity, and multidimensionality. He was awarded the 2020 Seattle Human Rights Commission's Individual Human Rights Leader Award, and in 2022, he was named the inaugural James Baldwin Fellow by the Northwest African American Museum. Marcus, thank you for joining me on the stage, and I will hand it over to you.
Lauren, thank you so very much. I got to pay you to do all of my intros everywhere because you just knock it out the park every single time. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you have enjoyed this conference thus far. I will be honest with you. I do not know why the organizers continue inviting back a cynically minded journalist such as myself, because I assume by virtue of your profession in the behavioral sciences that you are already plenty cynical enough. But alas, I am here and grateful to be here. So thank you. Given the abundance of trained mental health specialists here today, this conference seems as good a place as any to admit to you that around this time of year, I find myself speaking to my deceased brother. I tell him things that I wish I would have said while he was alive. Things like, I'm sorry. I should have seen that you needed treatment and not scolding. My brother DeMarcus passed away 2 years ago in a freak accident. He was sleeping in his trailer with a generator to keep him warm. Unfortunately, the generator had a leak and he died from carbon monoxide poisoning. He came into my family's life permanently when he was 8 years old. Prior to that, he'd been born to a mother who used crack cocaine throughout her pregnancy with him. He was shuttled between home environments where he witnessed drug use, the acts of men brutally assaulting women, and robbery as a means of sustenance. It took him years living with my parents to undo the conditioning from the toxicity and corrosiveness of that upbringing. And in truth, as much love, prayer, and youth sports as my parents tried to surround him with, he was never fully able to shake off the odiousness of his early upbringing. I remember at times as he grew into his early 20s, expressing my disappointment in him when he'd come home high, or when he'd gone to jail again for God knows what, or when he'd berate a romantic partner. I called it tough love, but I wonder sometimes if it wasn't just callousness. I could never understand why he just couldn't overcome his early conditioning, why the past was never far from his present and seemed to saddle his future. So I took the tack of having very little to do with him, rarely responding when he called. I lived my own life and left him with whatever he made of his. There isn't a day I don't wish that I actually saw his life for what it was. A navigation of post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, drug use, ADHD, and impulsivity, just to start. Those are things that could never be willed away with the optimum amount of grit and determination, but had to be managed with time, care, compassion, a behavioral health practice he needed to truly address the deep-seated agony he'd been born into. But it was too late to do that when I received a call 2 years ago that he and his girlfriend had died trying to keep themselves warm. I guess he felt that he couldn't call someone to say he needed to stay somewhere. I suppose that when you feel like there's little help available, you resort to the illogical. I bring up my brother because he reminds me of what this work is supposed to be rooted in, whether behavioral science, governance, or journalism. It's rooted at least it's supposed to be, in the needs of people, even when, especially when those needs are the hardest to address. Because I've witnessed in my decade-long career as a journalist that when those needs are greatest is when we tend to expel humanity from others, because it's easy and convenient to do so. It's how our society can make people into the lowest version of themselves. Currently, I'm working on a story about the criminal justice system, specifically the so-called juvenile justice system. As I'm sure many people have noticed, you can't throw a rock without hitting a story about the rise in juvenile crime, with tales of robberies, carjackings, and even murder. So it's been no surprise that in my work, I've heard demands that youth be punished without mercy. I've heard young people called human vermin, savages, and animals. I've heard people say that they should be locked away forever. With very little curiosity, our energy spent on how they became what they've become and how we might go about undoing this predicament. But I do understand this reflex. I understand the fear that permeates even the wisest, wokest, and best educated amongst us. I remember a few years ago walking down 3rd Avenue in downtown Seattle in the aftermath of a mass shooting that left a 50-year-old woman dead and a 9-year-old hospitalized. I remember the anxiety, fear, and rage that coursed through me. And for a moment, I joined with the chorus of folks wanting the harshest of punishments for the men involved. But 2 days later, I found out that one of the men was my brother DeMarcus's biological cousin. He'd experienced all of the same things growing up that DeMarcus had, except worse. He'd never had a foster family who took him in like my parents had for DeMarcus. I thought back to the young man who I'll call Will, who as a child had never had his dyslexia addressed. Instead, teachers labeled him as stupid. He never had any interventions to address the fetal alcohol syndrome he'd been born with. He never had anyone at any time step in to keep him from metabolizing the psychological trauma he experienced every day as normal. It all led him down a path of destruction, both to himself and others. Look, this is not to say that people should not be held accountable for their actions, but it is to say that so should we. We should be held collectively accountable for our inaction. There are thousands of Wills and DeMarcuses in this very state and county and across the country, people who are dehumanized by neglect. They are left with nothing in the way of resources that consistently prioritize their humanity at every stage of life. It's that dehumanization that begets dehumanization. A cycle that fills our streets with suffering, whether you visit 12th and Jackson or 3rd and Pine, or our youth detention facility in Alder Park. It's the youth in that facility. It's those youth that I can't help but wonder what our neglect will mutate them into as adults. Nearly 80% of them are children of color, more than double the percentage of children of color in the general population as a whole. They are disproportionately Black, and it is not difficult to see why. 53% of Black youth experience moderate depression. For the first time in history, Black teenagers' suicide rates are increasing faster than teens in any other racial or ethnic group. On average, Black kids report experiencing 5 racist incidents per day, which obviously corrodes mental health. Their anger, stress, and anxiety resulting from those incidents is often taken as aggression. and they are disciplined at disproportionately higher rates than their white peers. Those seeking help from a behavioral health professional will find that only 4% of psychologists in the US are Black, and only 80% of mental health professionals lack training in race-based trauma. These facts contribute to Black people's reluctance many times to seek mental health support. Given that data, quite frankly, I'm surprised why there aren't more broken youth and crimes than there currently are. I want to be clear. I know that the need for behavioral health resources is currently greater than I know that the need for behavioral health services is currently greater than the capacity to provide them. I also know that it is easier to appeal to a constituency asking for solutions that immediately incarcerate rather than gradually heal. But I also know with full certainty that unless we put healing and behavioral care at the heart of our education, our policies, and our healthcare systems, we will continue to have disparity in both pain and harm, both in our streets and our prisons and our lives. We can have a future where we stop the creation of broken, tortured, and traumatized people who go on to break, torture, and traumatize others. Or we can end up devoting more resources towards stabilizing social ills without ever rectifying the catalyst of those ills. What I've learned the hard way from my brother's death is that the time to give up on people, at least as social servants, is never. As hard as it can be. There are people without power, without resources, without options, and without hope that anyone actually cares about their well-being. So what I ask that we do as we leave this conference is a simple thing. It's to remember that we can be the answer to their prayers. We can be the answer to other people's prayers if we never lose sight of their humanity. I thank you for the privilege of your time today, and thank you again for having me at this conference.